Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that we have launched a dedicated portal on our website to help improve your answer writing skills. From today onwards, the questions that we provide at the end of the Hindu analysis shall be uploaded on the portal, where you can start practicing answer writing based on the detailed discussions that we have each day in our Hindu analysis. I urge you to make this a daily practice because it will not only help improve your answer writing skills, but you will also get an opportunity to peer review the answers of other students. This is one of the best ways to help you identify the strategies needed for good answers, and it will also help you identify where you are going wrong by looking at the answers of other students during peer review. So kindly make use of this initiative, and the link for the same shall be shared in the description box below. With this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This article deals with the topic of teacher welfare in India. See, in our civilizational and cultural ethos, the teacher or the guru is given a pivotal position as they help nurture the knowledge ecosystem. We often place our teachers on the same pedestal as that of our parents, as they play a definitive role in the shaping of our characters, our thought process, and as well as our abilities. In return for this priceless service rendered, we show immense respect and gratitude towards our teachers. But unfortunately, in our education system, the very same teachers have been forced to face dire circumstances as a result of very poor working conditions, below par salaries, and a complete absence of social security. In this column, the writers particularly focus on private unaided colleges, where teachers have been forced to face extremely poor working conditions, which has threatened their livelihood and their well being. See, as we have been discussing since the last 1.5 years, the pandemic has carried out a major disruption in the education sector. The pandemic has forced schools and colleges to shift towards online education, and this massive shift has come with a lot of disruption. Initially, when the pandemic broke out, the schools and colleges were suddenly expected to shift towards online education, and it was no doubt a challenging phase for them. But however, almost all the private colleges and schools recovered very quickly, and they not only put in place an online education format, but they even continued with their fees collection, thereby completely protecting their revenue stream. So, as far as private schools and private unaided colleges are concerned, the revenue stream was never affected by the pandemic because either they had already collected the fees from the students or they continued collecting the fees as they managed to provide uninterrupted education. But shifting to the online model also means that the operational cost for schools and colleges came down drastically, thereby increasing their profit margins. So, interestingly, the education sector, especially the online education sector, is something that has thrived during the pandemic. And the private managements which run these schools and colleges, especially higher educational institutions, have made enormous profits. But unfortunately, this hasn't translated into material gains for the teachers. The teachers, who are at the very heart of the education system, have been largely neglected by private managements. And despite their tremendous effort and struggles in adapting to online teaching, they have been punished by the private managements by either laying them off or by forcing the teachers to take massive cuts in their salaries. The writers observe that studies across the country have shown that private managements have used the pandemic as an excuse to either terminate several teachers from their jobs or they have forced the teachers to take a salary cut by citing the difficulties created by the pandemic. But contrary to these claims being made by private managements, all available evidence indicates that the shift towards online education has actually benefited these schools and colleges because their revenue stream has not been affected and in fact their operational cost has gone down. But for teachers on the other hand, they have had to face enormous physical, emotional and financial stress in order to adapt to these new forms of teaching. Because it's not easy for every teacher to quickly switch towards online teaching, especially for those who are used to traditional forms of teaching. This would have taken a lot of physical effort for teachers around the country, and upon this, the poor working conditions and the poor salaries and the salary cuts has placed them under severe emotional stress. In fact, several heart-wrenching stories have come out from around the country where teachers have been forced to take up additional jobs in order to help sustain their livelihood and continue supporting their families. The writers of this column were part of a survey conducted in Tamil Nadu, which highlights the poor working conditions being faced by teachers during the pandemic and how their welfare has actually been compromised and worsened during the pandemic. As teachers were forced to adapt to online teaching, many schools and colleges they failed to provide the adequate resources to the teachers and they expected the teachers themselves to arrange for mobile phones, laptops and internet connection. This survey itself has brought out how teachers from private unaided colleges had to spend from their own pockets to get a high speed internet connection or to purchase new phones and laptops. This has further placed the teachers under financial stress as the private managements have failed to provide them with adequate resources. Then, despite all these efforts and physical, emotional, and financial stress, several teachers have been laid off from their jobs or they have been forced to take a salary cut by the private managements. So, through this column, the writers are trying to shed light on the poor working conditions of teachers in India and how this undercuts our objective to strengthen our education system. This unfortunate trend will definitely affect the quality of teaching in the country, and as the future of the country and the country's knowledge system lies in the hands of the teachers, it will definitely lead to long lasting impact on our education system. The writers also point out that this is a problem that has come up not just because of the pandemic. Even before the pandemic, teachers were subjected to very poor working and living conditions. And across private and government schools and colleges, and across lower education and higher education, their salaries have often been very low, way below the market standards. And this survey conducted in Tamil Nadu alone has shown that highly qualified teachers in private unaided colleges have been receiving salaries of just around 10,000 to 25,000 per month. This is despite the teachers having high qualification, and many of them who are included in the survey are PhD holders, they fulfill the qualifying criteria set by UGC, or they would have cleared the national eligibility test. Despite possessing such high qualification, many of them receive very poor salaries. And as compared to this industry standard, the 7th Pay Commission has recommended a minimum salary of at least 75,000 per month for teachers of the rank of assistant professor. Then upon this, many of the private unaided colleges, they fail to provide any type of social security to teachers and they have very poor insurance coverage. Then as discussed, teachers are not even provided adequate resources to enable them to teach online. And according to the writers, these dire circumstances are a direct result of the poor government regulation of the higher education sector. See, since the 1990s, as the Indian state retreated and as it started adopting more neoliberal policies, it started creating more space for private players to take over key sectors such as education, especially higher education. Even though the state has a strong presence in lower education, it has largely retreated from higher education, thereby vacating the space for the private sector. This withdrawal of the state from higher education has been accompanied with decreasing government regulation of the higher education sector. So this lack of government regulation provided an open field for private colleges to exploit the education sector only with the profit motive. See here, the motive of profit is not entirely wrong because of course any private enterprise will be driven by the profit motive. This is what helps sustain a business and there is absolutely nothing wrong in eyeing profits. But the problem arises when these profits are not equitably distributed amongst the stakeholders who would have helped grow the business in the first place. In India, we have noticed an unfortunate trend, especially in higher education, where private managements are cornering all the profits while conveniently ignoring the poor working conditions being faced by teachers. Hence, the writers make a strong case for regulating the sector, especially with regard to working conditions of teachers, and they call upon the concerned state governments to step in and bring in government regulation to fix higher minimum salaries for teachers, along with mandating the private managements to clear any pending dues and arrears, followed by orders to reinstate those teachers who have been removed by citing the pandemic as an excuse. The writers also state that through such regulation, the government will have to mandate private education institutions to reimburse the teachers for the financial losses they have incurred, especially with regard to what they have spent on procuring basic resources like phones and internet connections. Here, the Kerala model can offer an example for the other states because the Kerala government has brought in such a regulation through an act which fixes a decent higher minimum salary for teachers and also tries to guarantee basic social security measures. Now, let's take up a column from page number 7 that deals with the topic of flood management. See, recently, Western Europe was hit with devastating floods, and according to the writer, this European experience offers valuable lessons for India. As we have been discussing over the last couple of days, climate change and global warming are driving the higher frequency and intensity of extreme weather events such as cyclones, cloudbursts, flooding, etc. So, the latest flooding seen in Europe has been attributed to climate change, and several countries, including Germany, Switzerland, Netherlands, Belgium, United Kingdom, and even Luxembourg, were seriously hit, resulting in considerable loss of life and property in these countries. Amongst these flooded countries, Germany struggled to cope with the disaster despite having better resources and advanced infrastructure. See, Germany is quite well prepared for such flooding disasters, especially with regard to its early warning and forecasting systems. Germany has put in place an advanced forecasting model that provides for accurate estimates of rainfall and flooding, and it has also installed an advanced network of sensors that measures water levels in real time. But despite the presence of such resources and advanced infrastructure, Germany had to struggle because its response was not adequate and timely. Even though the early warnings and forecasts came in, the disaster management authorities couldn't respond in time, as Germany was not used to such high intensity disasters that occur at a rapid pace. These floods in Western Europe were triggered by very intense rainfall that occurred over a very short period of time. This excess precipitation that occurred within a span of few hours at a particular location led to massive flooding, and even though the early warnings came in, the authorities couldn't respond in time to carry out timely evacuations. Data from European countries has shown that these countries received nearly a month's rainfall in just a span of 24 hours, which led to the rapid filling up of rivers. And even before the warnings and the forecasts could be disseminated to the local people, the water bodies had started to flood, thereby inundating the nearby cities, villages, and towns. And before the authorities could respond and before the people could evacuate, the floods had already hit them very hard, resulting in enormous damage to life and property. So, this represents the new phase of extreme weather events that are driven by climate change. The occurrence of such high intensity rainfalls in a short period at a particular location has gone up over the last few years, and countries around the world are suffering from its impact. Even in India, if you look at states such as Kerala, Maharashtra, Uttarakhand, they have all suffered devastating floods over the last few years, and in all the cases, these floods were triggered by massive intensive rainfall that occurred over a very short period of time that led to the breaching of the water carrying capacity of the drainage channel. The occurrence of such incidents has been correlated with climate change and global warming, because studies have shown that as more and more CO2 and greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere, it results in the warming of the atmosphere, which not only drives up evaporation, thereby introducing more moisture into the atmosphere, but it also leads to the greater accumulation of moisture in the atmosphere because warmer air tends to hold more moisture. So, when there is precipitation, naturally there is going to be more rainfall. So, along with higher moisture levels in the atmosphere, we are dealing with a situation where storms are lingering at a particular place. This is a direct result of rising temperatures at the polar areas. As the temperatures of the poles are increasing, The movement of cyclonic storms, particularly in the mid latitudes, has slowed down because rising temperatures affect wind circulation and the movement of storms. So, this leads the storms to linger at a particular place, and when they are carrying excess moisture in the atmosphere, it naturally results in very intense rainfall at a particular location over a very short period of time. This is what creates flash flood like conditions, and in just a matter of few hours, the drainage capacity of the water basin gets breached, and as a result, rivers, lakes, wetlands, and all the other water bodies, including man made dams, canals, and channels, they all start overflowing, leading to the inundation of the nearby habited areas. But amongst all these West European countries which were hit by floods, Netherlands has fared relatively better, and the loss of life and property in the country has been limited, largely because of the efficient water management practices of Netherlands. Hence, the writer says that this experience of Europe offers valuable lessons for India. And the first lesson is that India should realize that such extreme weather events are going to increase in the coming years as a result of climate change and global warming, and we need to prepare for this. The second lesson for India would be to learn from the Dutch experience, because through efficient and sustainable flood management techniques, the Dutch have been able to limit the damage caused by these floods. This success of the Dutch is attributed to their superior organizational structure, to their better preparedness, and more importantly, to their advanced flood management system, which is very sustainable. See, just like any other country, Netherlands also relies upon man-made structures like dams, barrages, canals in order to help contain the flood waters. But apart from this, Netherlands has also developed an intricate network of flood management, which happens to be nature friendly and ecologically sensitive. Netherlands has adopted a concept of living with water instead of trying to contain or restrict the flow of water. Through its flood management practices, Netherlands has created more space, that is more natural space for collecting excess water, thus helping in containing the flood situation. By adopting this sustainable, ecologically sensitive approach, Netherlands has created more space in the floodplains, riverbeds, and canals by clearing these areas of any encroachments and any habitations, and has turned these spaces into natural water reservoirs. These spaces are designed naturally to collect the excess water during the flooding season, thereby creating an ecosystem where humans cohabit the space with water, and the excess water during flooding season doesn't threaten human habitations because there are ready natural channels available to absorb the excess water. Now, this is a very valuable lesson for countries like India because in our country, most of the floodplains, the riverbeds, and the natural channels, they have been completely encroached through illegal construction and illegal settlements. Now, if you look at floods in Uttarakhand and floods in Kerala, the damage to life and property has been very severe, primarily because we haven't provided any space for excess water to flow and accumulate. Naturally, when the floodplains and riverbeds are blocked through encroachments and as well as by waste and debris, the flood water will tend to overflow. And once the water carrying capacity of the drainage channels is breached, it will immediately inundate the human habitations. This is what results in enormous damage to life and property. So India will have to learn these lessons from the Dutch experience, and we need to wake up to the threat of rising frequency and strength of extreme weather events which are being driven by climate change. So India will have to start adopting such sustainable and environment-friendly flood management practices, which allows us to live with water by creating enough space for excess water so that the natural drainage system itself is able to contain the flood waters. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 that deals with the topic of human trafficking and the Trafficking in Persons Bill that the government is looking to introduce in the parliament, which we had covered and analyzed in detail on the 19th of July. So for a detailed understanding of what is human trafficking and why is it a serious crime, and to understand a critical evaluation of the Trafficking in Persons Bill, you can go back and watch this video. But this column written by Kailash Satyarthi, a Nobel laureate, known for his work with regard to child welfare, provides a greater insight into this important topic. As we discussed the other day, the biggest victims of human trafficking happen to be women and children. According to the writer, the threat posed by human trafficking to women and particularly to children has gone up during the pandemic because the pandemic has further increased the vulnerability of this section. Children who have dropped out of school and children who have been orphaned by the COVID-19 pandemic, they are extremely vulnerable for human trafficking. And the government data itself shows that trafficking incidents have gone up since the lockdown. So, as women and children are becoming more vulnerable to human trafficking, it becomes important to understand the seriousness of this crime and what measures are needed to combat this menace. See, human trafficking refers to the selling of women and children as commodities after they have been kidnapped or after they have been duped. Quite often, the victims of human trafficking they are pushed into child labor, child marriage, into prostitution, and they even end up as bonded labor and they are even forced to take up beggary. Along with contributing to such social evils, human trafficking can also drive up other forms of organized crime. See, human trafficking, which in itself is an organized crime, is seen as a national security threat because these criminal cartels and mafias, which run the human trafficking networks, are known to be linked with drug trafficking cartels, with illicit trade and smuggling, and sometimes even with terrorism. In fact, all forms of organized crime, such as drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and human trafficking, they're all interlinked and they all share connections with money laundering and terrorism. So, this makes human trafficking not just a grave threat for human rights, but also a grave national security threat. By kidnapping women and children, and by selling them like commodities, and by forcing them into harsh and inhuman forms of labor, human trafficking results in the direct violation of basic human rights. When young children and girls are pushed into child labor or forced labor, or maybe into prostitution, it results in the gross violation of their human rights and hampers the overall socio-economic welfare of the country. Plus, the interlinkages of this organized crime with drug trafficking, smuggling, and terrorism also turns it into a national security threat. It is in this regard that the constitution makers had the foresight to make human trafficking and immoral trafficking a punishable offense within the fundamental rights. We have Article 23 of the Constitution that prohibits trafficking and forced labor, and this is the only offense punishable under the Constitution, besides untouchability, which has been abolished under Article 17. These are the only two offenses that the Constitution explicitly prohibits and provides for punishment. So, this in itself highlights the importance of our fight against human trafficking. And in this context, the writer evaluates the bill that the government is looking to table in the parliament. For a more detailed analysis of the provisions, including its pros and cons, you can go back and watch our video from the 19th of July. In this column, the writer appreciates the bill proposed by the government for trying to address the socio-economic root causes that contributes to human trafficking, along with its provisions that provide for strict punishment to the culprits, followed by measures looking to protect and provide rehabilitation to the victims of human trafficking. While all these provisions are appreciable, the bill does fall short on certain accounts, as we discussed on the 19th of July. So the writer calls upon the government to plug these shortcomings to make this an effective law against human trafficking, and he calls for enough checks and balances in order to prevent the misuse of these provisions by the authorities. Then, since the nature of this crime is constantly evolving, he calls for a periodic review of the law in order to update the law as and when required, and urges the government to allocate enough resources to enable the authorities to fight against this inhuman offense. Overall, the writer is calling for an effective implementation of this law once it is enacted by the parliament. Now let's take up an article from page number 8, which is related to the AgriStack initiative of the Government of India. See, the Ministry of Agriculture is working along with the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology to create a digital ecosystem for India's agriculture sector known as AgriStack. AgriStack will be a collection of technologies and digital databases that focuses exclusively on farmers and the agri sector. Under this initiative, the government is looking to create a unified platform for farmers through which the government can provide targeted services to the farmers and the agriculture sector. Under this initiative, the government is looking to set up a digital database to link the digital land records, which in turn will help in identifying the beneficiaries of various government schemes. In this regard, several concerns have been raised with regard to the data security of farmers and as well as with regard to the exclusion of few farmers from the database. To these concerns that were raised in the parliament, the Union Agriculture Minister has responded and stated that no landless farmers will be included in the new database. For now, only land-owning farmers will be brought under the digital database and it would be linked with their digital land records. For now, the system will focus on those who are legal owners of agricultural land, and later the government will consider the possibility of including others. So in the initial version, the government is looking to exclude landless farmers and tenant farmers, as it is initially focused on creating a database to provide for targeted delivery of services to the beneficiaries of various government schemes. Then on the question of data security, the government has said that as of now, no private firms are involved in this project, and a new data policy is also being framed in order to protect the data security of the farmers. Then coming to page number 11, the UN's International Organization for Migration has informed that nearly 970 Mediterranean migrants have died while carrying out the dangerous sea crossing across the Mediterranean Sea, as refugees and migrants from North Africa and West Asia try to flee into Europe in order to escape war, misery, poverty, and conflicts. So this provides us an opportunity to briefly talk about the Mediterranean migration and as well as look at a few key points related to the International Organization for Migration. See, the Mediterranean countries such as Spain, France, Italy, Greece, and the others have been constantly receiving a huge influx of refugees and migrants. And over the last several years, thousands have crossed over as they attempt to flee wars and conflicts and escape poverty from across these North African countries and West Asian countries. Then coming to the International Organization for Migration, it is an intergovernmental organization that provides services and advice with regard to migration to governments and as well as to migrants. It deals with internally displaced persons or IDPs who are displaced within the boundaries of a country due to wars and conflicts. And it also serves refugees who are fleeing conflicts from one country to another, and as well as to migrant workers, especially to illegal migrants who cross over international boundaries illegally. This organization was established in 1951, and then it was known as the Intergovernmental Committee for European Migration. It was established to help resettle people who were displaced during the Second World War. Right now, it has been designated as one of the related organizations of the United Nations, and it consists of 174 member states and 8 observer states as per the website of the International Organization for Migration. This organization is dedicated for promoting humane and orderly migration by working closely with governments, NGOs, and intergovernmental institutions. Its constitution acknowledges the link that exists between migration and socio-economic and cultural factors which pushes people to migrate either as IDPs or as refugees or as illegal migrants. The organization recognizes the right of freedom of movement of the displaced people, and it mainly works in 4 broad areas that are related to migration management. This includes migration and development, facilitating migration, regulating migration, and forced migration. The work of this organization cuts across promotion of international migration law and promoting policy debates and providing guidance to governments and NGOs around the world. It also seeks to protect the rights of migrants, including their basic fundamental rights and healthcare rights. The organization also brings in the gender dimension to migration and gives special attention to women and children. Next, on page number 6, we have an editorial that deals with the border dispute that has emerged between Assam and Mizoram. But we have covered this topic in complete detail in our yesterday's analysis. So kindly go back and watch that video and go through the editorial once. Then on the same page, we have another column related to Afghanistan, and the discussion over here is exactly the same as to what we have covered in our previous classes. So just refer to the videos of the last couple of weeks and go through this column once. Then coming to mains practice questions, the first question, welfare of teachers is largely neglected in India and the pandemic has worsened their conditions. In this context, examine the working conditions faced by teachers along with suggestions to improve their status. The second question, the recent floods in Europe call attention to the global need for countries to implement nature-friendly policies and ecologically sensitive flood protection measures. Discuss. So for writing answers to these questions, you can visit the portal, for which the link will be shared in the description box below. And as you can see over here, the questions will be segregated as per our syllabus and subjects. And on a daily basis, the new questions will be uploaded, where you can write and submit your answers. And after that, you can even conduct a peer review amongst yourselves in order to develop a better understanding of answer writing strategies. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.